So, if we may, let's reflect a bit. The Nintendo Game Boy got its first taste of vampire killing action with 1989's Castlevania the Adventure, which was less of a video game and more of a slothing test of endurance. Hence the reason why that game got a WiiWare remake 20 years later, and we'll get to that one next time. Sometime later, the Game Boy got its second taste with Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge, a considerably drastic improvement over the initial offering of Castlevania due to its slightly faster speed, somewhat better platforming, and gameplay that more closely resembled that of the NES Castlevania trilogy. The Game Boy wouldn't get another Castlevania game until 1997 with Castlevania Legends. Legends was originally conceived to be the first chronological battle between the Belmont clan and Count Dracula, with protagonist Sonia being the first Belmont to fight the Count. That is until Igarashi said, no way, this game is not canon, the first Belmont to fight Dracula is Leon Belmont.
Who's Leon?
And so Lament of Innocence became the starting point of the whole Castlevania saga. That is until David Cox and Mercury Steam came along with the fearsome Boot of Re and said, nah, screw that, mate. So, if you were to remove the canon issues and whatnots, Castlevania Legends storyline basically boils down to something like this. Bad guy vampire count shows up, bad guy vampire count does bad things, girl kills monsters, girl eventually kills the bad guys, and girl gives birth. Simple enough. The legend begins. Or doesn't begin. I'm confused. I don't care. Let's move on. So if you played the previous Game Boy iterations of Castlevania, then Legends will be old hat. You go from beginning to end in each level, kill bosses, collect hearts, pick up orbs to upgrade your leather whip to a chain whip and later a fireball shooting chain whip, and just plod through the 6 levels that the game lays out before you. It's a pretty straightforward old school Castlevania games with ropes, except with a couple minor differences. Okay, first of all, there's no boss meter. That bottom meter in the bottom, it's actually a counter to an additional ability that you could summon on a whim by pressing A and B at the same time. Takes a bit to pull off, you won't get it right off the bat, but you'll know it's done right when Sonia glows or something like that. This is something the game likes to call Burning Mode, a temporary state where you gain temporary invincibility, as well as a short burst of speed, so you'll be able to move a lot quicker through those sections and not have to worry about taking damage. It's a pretty helpful tool that can make life easier in some cases, and can dwindle boss fights to mindless button mashing sessions, but you can only use this ability once per level, and outside of sacrificing a life, I don't know of any means to replenish this ability. Maybe I'm missing something, maybe I'm not. Of course, if you don't care for such a thing, and you want to challenge the game fairly or something, you could ignore this ability altogether. And while this ability does take a bit to pull off, there are times where you could pull it off by accident if you press A and B at the same time, but again, whatever. The other thing is that there are no sub-weapons to be found and used in the game. Well, technically they are in Legends per se, hiding along alternate paths, but they're more collectible items than actual weapons that you could use. They serve more to add an additional bit to the ending if you collect all 5. Rather, you'll be using soul powers that you acquire by defeating bosses. Soul powers can either stop time, replenish health, or shoot projectiles. While not a bad inclusion, I much rather prefer using cross boomerangs and holy water as my sub-weapons. You know, the classics. Beyond that, Legends applies minor tweaks to the controls. Sonia can now control her jump in midair, which makes life a bit easier when it comes to those perilous jumps. Also, Sonia can crawl while crouching, an ability first introduced in Super Castlevania 4. And the controls are pretty responsive for the most part, only the burning mode, like I said before, sometimes is tricky to pull off despite the command being pretty simple. But aside from that, the controls work fairly well, and Sonia is at least mobile enough to perform basic platforming feats. There are 6 levels in Castlevania Legends, one of which is accessible by stumbling across a hidden passage. While it doesn't seem like much, the one notable thing is that these levels are long, almost to the point of feeling endless, and some levels will have a mid-boss for you to fight, which helps to alleviate the monotony of the levels. At certain times you'll come across a split path along the way. One path will continue onwards towards the level and the end boss, while another will lead you down an alternate path where you'll find either a health restoring roast or a 1-up or one of the 5 story essential but unusable sub-weapon items to add to the collection. I like the idea, but not necessarily the implementation, especially since this alternate path essentially leads to a dead end, and you'll have to backtrack and lose precious time in doing so. And Legends gives you just about enough time to find the sub-weapon and make it to the boss. You can't merely take your time or anything like that, you have to keep moving or else you will die. Other prior Castlevania games had time limits, it goes without saying, but you usually had a bit more leeway in those games at the rate you could progress in a level, whether you want to make it through as quickly as possible, or stick around a segment and grind for hearts and points and stuff. Even the later Castlevania Rebirth gave you more than enough time that you could make it through a level while also exploring alternate paths that will get you through much quicker or lead to bonus rooms or something like that. And while the levels in Rebirth were long, there were more than enough interesting things going on in those levels that it didn't really get boring after a while. The same cannot be said for Castlevania Legends and its 6 levels, which are long, drawn out, and can get pretty boring rather quickly. And Sonia's short chain whip doesn't help matters either, sometimes requiring you to get a little too close and personal to even register a hit on an opponent. At the very least, however, you can upgrade to a fireball shooting whip, much like the previous Game Boy entries, and there's nothing in this game that will downgrade your whip power outside of death. Of course, if you want to forego all that, you could always pick the light mode at the start of the game, which starts you off with a fully powered whip. Interestingly enough, Legends is pretty much the only Game Boy entry to feature some of the more familiar Castlevania enemies. While the 2 past entries in the Game Boy line did feature bats and mudmen and fishmen, the games had their own cast of characters, including the rolling eyeballs, the Zeptos, and those mouth things that shot orbs that depowered your whip. In Legends, you don't have the Game Boy exclusive foes, but rather the familiar Bone Pillars, the Spear Knights, and the Sword Lords from Dracula X even. You'll even fight classic bosses such as Medusa and the Grim Reaper, even if those forms are not up to par. So in that regard, Legends does try to incorporate more classic foes into the game and close the disparity, the gap between the two, the NES and the Game Boy side, which is probably a wise move considering the original enemies in Legends aren't all that great. I mean, fireballs in a slight pattern, clay walls blocking your paths. All of a sudden I'm starting to miss the rolling eyeballs. Speaking of which, you'd figured that by the 3rd Game Boy entry, Konami would have mastered the ability to draw on a Belmont sprite with some semblance of hair. But alas, that's not the case. Sonia Belmont, much like Christopher Belmont before her, or after her, whatever, doesn't matter, is still bald in the game, with only a flimsy ponytail hanging by the back of her head. It looks pretty bad, actually. The enemies look a bit better and with some definition, but there are some standout duds in the pack, like the zombies, for example. Not spectacular looking. The level design's also somewhat uninspired. It seems like they were trying to recreate sections from Symphony of the Night, which was the big Castlevania game at the time, but it doesn't really look like much. Suffice it to say, Belmont's Revenge definitely had better looking levels. The only saving points in Legends, visually wise, are a couple of the animated intermission sequences and the mugshots, which are nicely drawn at least. Other than that, Legends' graphical prowess leaves something to be desired. However, Legends does boast Super Game Boy compatibility. In addition to a nice looking stone border, the game also changes color palettes depending on the level you're on. It's not a big deal, but it is a nice touch and something you could only get on the Super Game Boy, because the Game Boy player that you add onto the GameCube won't give you these kinds of nice little features. They'll just give you the weird Game Boy color palette that the colorizing Game Boy thing. I don't know, this is why I like the Super Game Boy better than the Game Boy player, because with the Super Game Boy you get these neat little effects and these borders and stuff. Nice touch, if nothing else. Legend recycles some of the sound effects from Belmont's Revenge, and you know what, that's okay. That's to be expected. Lots of games do this. They recycle games from, the same catalog. It's no big deal. They did change the death jingle in Legends, and it somehow sounds worse than before. Yeah, the music in Legends overall is actually not that great. It's okay-ish, but not that great. Some would probably be pleased with the inclusion of Bloody Tears in the first level of the game and a brief snippet of Vampire Killer towards the end of the game. But beyond that, this is probably the weakest sounding soundtrack of the Game Boy Vania trilogy. Even Castlevania the Adventure, with its crappy gameplay and sluggish hero, had some strong instrumentation in its meager audio soundtrack, whereas Legends' instrumentation ruins the music, making what could have been decent compositions a tad worse as a result. And then there's the music that plays during the cutscenes. Ear rape as its absolute finest. Even so, I'd still prefer this over the shitty voice acting in Symphony of the Night. In conclusion, although Castlevania Legends is still yards better than the first Game Boy Adventure, it is a lesser game than its immediate predecessor, Belmont's Revenge. There are minor control tweaks and a couple interesting ideas added to the game that seem like a step forward, but then there's the removal of usable sub-weapons, needlessly long and uninspired level design, and an overall lesser presentation than what came before. The end result is a Castlevania Legend that is serviceable and somewhat competently done, but is no better than what already came before and was already available beforehand. Castlevania enthusiasts who have never played this one might want to give it a shot, but given the non-canonical status of the game and the fact that there are better alternatives in the series, you're not really missing out on much by skipping this one.